everyone, and welcome to the IJIRP Podcast, an initiative of the Indian Journal of Interdisciplinary Research and Policy. I am Anushka Sharma, editorial intern at IJIRP, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's episode. At IJIRP, we aim to foster meaningful conversations that bridge research, policy, and practice across multiple disciplines. Through this podcast, we bring together distinguished academicians, legal professionals, and industry experts to share their expertise and knowledge when it comes to issues of contemporary relevance. It is my great pleasure to welcome our esteemed guest, Professor Ajay Gudavarthy, sir, who's an associate professor at JNU, Center for Political Studies. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Thank you, Anushka.
Look forward to an engaging and insightful conversation. So starting off, since the whole series is about different voices of research, I want to start with how you actually work. Because you've moved through movements, violence, populism, emotions, all with different subjects. So do you carry the method into each, or does the method itself change depending on what you're trying to understand?
I'm essentially trained as a political theorist, right? And my method of a political theorist would be that of combination of observation, interpretation, and to disturb the logical consistency of concepts. That's the that the essential engagement is conceptual. That do concepts do what they promise to do? So to take an instance, toleration as a concept, it talks about civil coexistence between groups, right? So, but the question that a political theorist might want to ask is that in the process of bringing no unlikely groups together for coexistence, does it also reinforce power hierarchies, relations of domination between them, which the concept of toleration originally does not imagine. So it is to disturb the conceptual and to bring in practices. At least that's the way I do. There are other ways of doing. People do intellectual histories where they look at concepts, long duration histories, other ways of doing. But my method of doing is this, that theoretically looking at concepts in terms of not what they normatively promise, and then go on refining it. Mostly political theory is done this way, right? What more to add? An ideal type, like John Rawls gives an ideal type model.
Well, stuff for the next question. Whenever you're picking up something new, whenever you're researching about something new, how do you know a question is worth researching as opposed to something that is just sounding interesting in the moment?
Well, many aspects, the primary reason how we pick up a research topic is that we essentially look at the gap in the literature.
Yes.
That's the key method through which you go, that when I pick up topics, I've jotted down some points here. When I did a piece on human rights movements in India, I don't know if you've seen that piece.
No, sir.
That is titled Human Rights Movements in India, State, Civil Society and Beyond. It was published in Contributions to Indian Sociology Journal, right, in 2008. So there was a lot of literature on human rights, but nobody looked at the different phases, human rights and civil rights movement. So that's one way of picking a topic. That what is the literature gap in the literature? No, that
What
piece
has not been discussed.
What has not been discussed. So that piece went into reading lists across globe. I saw in Swedish universities, in Singapore, and friends told me that it covered a very important. My academic colleagues said, it plugged a very important gap in the literature. So that's one way you can pick a topic in terms of. The second is when you strongly disagree with existing frames, like my work on my responses to post-colonial theory. Right, that's one way. You must see my piece in EPW, Brahmanism, Liberalism, and Post-colonial Theory. That post-colonial theory promised few things. It is definitely a very productive and a subversive project of its time. But then over a period of time, you disagree with certain...
Like the contemporary developments.
Exactly. In light of contemporary developments, you actually feel that this theory is not working as it promised.
Yes.
Then that's where you begin to intervene. Third way, I think, is when in real concrete there are pressing issues that concern. So there's an unmediated direct relation with the reality, that you're interacting with people, with movements, with activists. I have wide connections with a lot of activists. So if there are new real-time issues, like you had the cockroaches movement, or you have earlier farmers movement, So that's the third way you pick up a topic, that there is something pressing. It needs to be theorized. It needs to be conceptualized, because that conceptualization will give you a better understanding of your own theoretical frame about democracy, and it's also useful for activists. So it's also a way of intervening in the political domain. So I don't believe in strict, rigid separation between academics and real-time politics that many of my colleagues do. They feel that academics should be. So there are two ways of doing it. Some believe you produce better academic work, more quality academic work, if you take step back and you're not a participant. I take a contrary view. But I think if you have involvement with reality, you look for micro, which doesn't mean you just go with the flow, but you also have a certain detachment, but you also have certain convictions with what is happening. That's the way I do my research.
Has there been a time in your career, in your research career, where you felt that the evidence pushed back hard enough that you had to abandon an argument that you were genuinely attached to?
Well, this is an interesting way to formulate the question. More than abandoning, I think I would say I was taken aback, where I felt that the earlier frameworks that one is working with are inadequate, right? So I don't think they have become irrelevant, but inadequate. And I think rise of populism in India was one such phenomenon, especially after 2014. With the rise of India after Modi book, as you know, there I felt that suddenly it signaled the role of symbolism, role of ethics, role of emotions, which I had not studied before. My earlier work was more in terms of institutions, policies, social dynamics, but this was a phenomena. I suddenly felt that old frames are not quite adequate, that they are not able to, I mean, they are not offering me very satisfactory ways of, because if you look at my work, this India after Modi also came slightly 2018-19.
Yes, sir.
So first 1 year I was struggling that how to make sense of this kind of rise, because the material policy analysis, what other academics were doing was very banal. I felt it was too straightforward, but the regime itself was working on a different registers.
Yes.
So that's where I moved from my early work, if you say, was critical theory framework. Then I moved to cultural sociology.
Okay.
That I started reading up fresh literature, and I should share this anecdote. One of the leading cultural sociologists, Geoffrey Alexander. I met him in Scotland, and we had a lot of arguments. That we disagreed, because I was working with critical theory frame and he was working. So we had, but we became good friends, and he started following my writings. So I started using writing about myths and mythologies and memory. So he wrote back to me saying, look, you have moved your frame to cultural sociology now. So then I started reading his work seriously, his book on performance and power. I read up that work and his work on civil sphere. So I started, but unlike him, I don't take an exclusive cultural sociology. I still, because he's completely dismissive of critical theory, like work of Nancy Fraser. But in my own work, I'm trying to recombine, after rise of populism, how to look at Nancy Fraser and cultural sociology. So I have in my head a dialogue between Nancy Fraser and Geoffrey Alexander, but that also in the Indian context, lot of that changes. Categories change. Categories transform. Yeah, that's it.
Now, sir, going back to some of your earlier works where you've talked of the Dalit movements, Naxalite movements, and that's basically what became politics of post-civil society, where you essentially argue that the term civil society doesn't quite hold up in the Indian context. So what made you realize that the vocabulary itself needed to change rather than just the analysis?
Look, this is where my third method, that my engagement with civil and political movements was at the center. That I had a very close engagement with these political movements. It was not like a researcher. It also comes from my personal family background. I have family members who are involved with these activists, civil rights activists, feminist movements, Dalit Bahujan politics, Naxalite movement. So I have had close family friends. So again, observing those practices, the nature of discourses these movements were floating on the ground, I had a sense that civil society was not proving to be an adequate concept. So my entire PhD and my first book, Politics of Post-Civil Civil Society, was to inaugurate this concept of post-civil society, to say that on the ground, political movements are inaugurating discourses that go beyond
Just
civil
the
society,
conventional.
notions of civil society. For instance, civil society talks about the idea of civility.
Hmm.
It presumes things are dialogic. Everything has to happen in the context of dialogue. But human rights movement, for instance, in India, argued that can violence be a legitimate means of protest in certain conditions?
Yes.
Is violence a precondition sometimes to force dialogue, to force a sense of civility? This is a completely new question, right?
Yes, sir, and actually that's my next question. The acceptable democratic politics.
I will come to that. So,
talk
this is this. So, what does this mean? That it means that the violence and dialogue and civility are not mutually exclusive.
Hmm.
So, I come from state of Telangana, erstwhile Andhra Pradesh, where we have witnessed three worst kind of massacres against Dalits in Karamchedu, Chundur, and Vempenta. It is only after counter violence did the dominant caste open up for the possibility of a dialogue. So this was a debate. It might be so, but that use of violence has other consequences, right?
Yes, sir.
So that's where it becomes very, very complex. Civil society then looks like a very sanitized, ideal type concept that let us all dialogue. But how do you even begin a dialogue? How do you begin a dialogue in very unequal society like India? Will Brahmins with consolidated power be ready to dialogue with other castes?
Yes, sir.
So what are those conditions? What kind of counter force? Is it civil disobedience? So things of this kind. So I went into the details. That first book, if you look, I collected a lot of documents about social movements, lot of interviews I carried out as part of fieldwork. We were also young then to run around to do a lot of fieldwork. Now my fieldwork happens in my room. I call it ethnography at doorstep. A lot of students and activists come and meet me now. So then I was a student, so I ran around collecting a lot of documents, a lot of interviews I conducted with activists. And therefore, that post civil society book came out of that. It's a very dense and thick book. You must have seen.
Yes.
So, where I've argued that India is experimenting with a post civil society condition where it is not abandoned civil society, but it highlights the restricted sense in which civil society has been imagined in liberal discourse. So I went into the entire history of civil society literature and trying to demonstrate in what ways these new practices were being inaugurated.
And so, when I talk of the contemporary issues, of course, my question is that more than a decade on, since 2013, more than a decade on, does that still describe what's happening in Indian movements? Because when we look at 2024 farmers' protest, that's a very good testament to the fact that, yes, the conventional structure does not hold up quite well of the civil society.
Well, the movements that I studied, the Naxalite movement, the civil rights movement, the Dalit Bahujan movements, I feel that the way I expected these movements, I call them I can't recollect the exact term, but something of dialectics of post-civil society. I felt that there was a dialectical movement,
Inner contradiction.
inner contradiction.
Something, yes.
Yeah, so something of that sort. I thought this would be a process that will evolve into a much higher form of a social practice. But I don't think that it happened that way. As you saw, Maoist movement, Naxalite movement kind of exhausted and collapsed. Civil rights movement is not able to be very innovative. Dalit Bahujan politics have also become very constrained in very narrow identity politics. So that was a learning experience that, that what I termed post-civil society is not something that really turned out. So then I started to investigate why do movements face this kind of limitations. So do movements have a shelf life? So is there this whole Hegelian thing that we move from thesis to antithesis and synthesis? There was no antithesis emerging, so why did movements die out this way? That was, I think, in Indian context, an interesting, this is what Gramsci calls the blocked dialectics. The dialectics also can get blocked, and So in India, being a very hierarchical society, I think it's way more complex to study how movements inaugurate, and then I think at certain point their imagination becomes too narrow,
Yes, sir.
and it's also very difficult to engage, because I keep interacting with them. There is not much space in any of these movements to offer internal critique, so that the movements reimagine a fresh imagination.
Just imagine.
That process is also very limited in the Indian context. So one can, if one wants to give an easy tag, one can call this is the overarching Brahmanical element, even among social activists, that they are not very creative. They don't think on their feet continuously. They don't think in dialectical terms.
Yes, sir.
Therefore, in my recent writings, I'd say that only dialecticians seem to be the right wing guys. In India, after Modi, I say that only the things people who are thinking in dialectical terms are the right wing populists. So that's the takeaway, that these movements, that the way I studied, it's not that insight is become irrelevant, but things don't actually flow. So therefore, it is to say that how knowledge grows, therefore, is not in a linear way, in a cumulative, additive manner. Sometimes you also learn from something that is not realized, a potential that existed, what we call in philosophy immanence. That there is immanent within the immanent existing contradictions, there is a potential, there is a possibility, but sometimes that potential doesn't get realized. So I think in Indian context, that should also be a point of study. Why did a movement not realize its potential? Why did it not follow up on its promise? What dies in a movement? So we do have global theorists who study things in cyclical terms. Things rise and die. Everything has a shelf life. I don't know if the temporal reasons can be one possible explanation, but this is how I see the process.
That's a very insightful take.
Mhm.
Now coming to the question about what falls outside acceptable democratic politics, um, that basically led to revolutionary violence versus democracy with respect to the Maoist case. So as a researcher, how do you study something like political violence closely enough to understand it without either, romanticizing it or condemning it from outside?
Well, this is in my book on revolutionary violence, that edited volume, and the previous book, Maoism, Democracy and Globalization. In both these, I try to understand the necessity of political violence that emerged in a certain context with the Naxalbari movement. But post rise of populism, I revisited that question. That, because every practice and concept, I think, lives in a certain context. And when the context changes, I think the meanings of the concept and its practices change, right? So post populist condition, when democracy has become more of symbolic power, when there is more of cultural politics, how does the question of violence come across? And that's where I wrote an elaborate introduction to that book, Revolutionary Violence, saying how role of social media, role of populism, role of cultural narratives are changing the dynamics. And the question is that revolutionary violence no longer works in the unmediated way in which it is originally envisaged. So I collected a lot of critical essays. That book was also translated into Telugu. There were a lot of critical interventions by pro radical left groups. They felt that this is an unfair critique. While I was trying to add to the discourse. So this is what I mean. Sometimes you try to add to the discourse, but it's not doesn't happen that way. People receive it in different ways. So that's why in modern life, communication itself is such a huge thing to study. That how do you get across your point the way you want to? That you write a critique so that the movement rethinks.
Again, so when we talk of Derrida, every understanding is a misunderstanding. That's also.
And there's always a possibility of what Derrida says, appropriation.
Yes, sir.
Problem of appropriation. So all these complications.
Yes, sir.
So I always felt that therefore revolutionary movements did not have that bandwidth wherewithal. They were coming from a certain locationality of abject structural exclusion. So what they were saying was relevant, but the reality is has many shades, has many layers. So from one vantage point, you cannot make complete sense. So that's where I think the movement lost out, and one of the reasons why we have seen its sharp decline is partly that it intellectually could not grasp the changing dynamics. And India changes very fast because of its inner complexities. There's a lot of space for change.
the book India After Modi,
Hmm.
where you essentially take a populist lens at the Indian right. So, past that, the word populism has a very distinctive political history. You look at Latin America, European, countries, European political discourse.
Hmm.
So, populism as a whole, how do you think it fits to India? Is it something that is borrowed onto India, or does it fit to India?
Which question is this?
So
Which
this is the book India After Modi.
no, but number of the question number in your.
This is the fifth or the sixth one.
No. You have not written the question numbers?
So this is different actually. That is
But I have,
just after the acceptable democratic.
the concept moved to populism, right?
Yes, sir.
What is your question?
That around at the same time, the book India After Modi also happened, which took a populist lens at the Indian right. Now, populism as a whole is has a very distinctive political history.
Hmm.
We look at Latin America and European countries. So, is it something that is fit to India? Is it something borrowed onto India?
Yeah. So, this way of studying this whole, I have tremendous disagreement. That a concept has an origin somewhere. The entire decolonial, post-colonial project is this, which our right-wing friends also are, using. That concepts have a certain time and space. So concepts born in Latin America cannot be used and have no relevance to Indian context. That's a very uh, ancient and a very provincial imagination, as if concepts don't travel, right? I did a international project, politics of taking my post-civil society. I did global post-civil society. I was trying to study. I did a comparative study of US, India, Brazil, and there was also Arab, but that didn't work out. What one observes is that ruling elites, dominant sections of society, learn from each other. So I could see parallels in the narratives, discourses between India and Brazil. So concepts travel. Just because the concept originated in Latin America does not mean that it is arrested within the historical context of Latin America. Of course, you'll have to, when you bring it to the Indian context. So today we are saying there's a global populist context because these rulers replicate the discourses, the strongman phenomena, the us versus them phenomena, the anti-elite phenomena, authentic people phenomena. This you find in Turkey, you find in United States. He's talking about white Christian Americans as authentic. Turkey, you go Sunni Muslims become authentic. India, Hindus become authentic. So what do you say? Is this not a parallel? Just because a concept is born in Latin America, should we arrest and say, don't come out of Latin America, you have to die there? So we are in a global, with social media, internet, with communication revolution, with network societies emerging across globe. Concept might have a certain historical velocity where they are born, but our ability to learn and unlearn is vastly transformed. So I don't simply understand this decolonial project, that digging in deep and finding some, that those concepts don't work. Even our own history, if you take and you dig out some concept in ancient India, will it be relevant in the modern context? Does that concept exactly work in the same way? You'll have to tweak your understanding of that concept because there are so many modern imperatives. Similarly, populism has certain parallel, yes, but it will have certain unique aspects. So you should read Sudipto Kaviraj as an interesting essay, What is Western about Western political theory? And he says there are three levels of generality. That there's a generality which is comparable across. There's a second layer of generality. Then he says there's only third layer of what you call the local, which might have incommensurate realities. So I'm not even sure if that is also true. Today in internet generation, I think even rural India has access to global India. Isn't it? People follow, with education reaching, technology reaching, and market. Education, technology, market have profoundly transformed the way people are thinking. Therefore, I did not hesitate using this concept of populism. I was perhaps the first one to write in the Indian context, theorize. There is no other book that I can think of in the Indian context because that concept gave me a ready entry point into the Indian phenomena because I think people, ruling elites, right wing, learned from global populist experiments and they were using it.
And adapt to them.
Adapt to them, exactly. But once you adapt, the concept does not play out exactly the way it plays out in Latin America. So that's the mistake left did.
Yes.
They were looking for a Russia and China and India. They were looking for a replay. So it doesn't happen that way. Then you observe that there are our own unique features that add on to this, our own cultural history. Therefore, in my writings, I have written that the populist turn in Brazil will not survive, and I'm vindicated by that. And I said the populist turn in India will have a longer shelf life because it has a deeper cultural resonance. So you can always observe these specificities, right? So generalities, comparison, and specificities are not mutually exclusive. Both can go hand in hand.
Yes, sir. Uh, so after 20 years of writing about movements and ideologies, politics, ethics, and emotions in New India turns to something that political science has long dismissed as irrational, that is emotions. So what actually changed for you?
You're right, that as I explained earlier, that was a very big shift in my writing. So a part of it, I explained to you my encounter with Jeffrey Alexander,
Yes, sir.
And my own discomfort and unhappiness with my old critical theory framework, that critical theory through its material, institutional aspects. So I reread critical theory debates. So the debate between especially Nancy Fraser and Axel Honneth proved to be extremely productive in understanding. And this study of ethics and emotion was completely new for me. That I had to reread. So I read up on emotion studies. As I said, I read up on social psychology, Eric Fromm, and other social psychologists who could help me understand how to put in psychological categories. I read Wilhelm Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism. So I discovered. So therefore, the interesting part, people ask me, how do you do it? The interesting part is if you have a concrete question in mind,
Yes, sir.
that question will also guide you towards the literature because you keep looking, right? So when you're looking for an answer for how to explain certain phenomena, so when I start, then I think you land up with those texts.
Yes, sir.
Isn't it? So,
Yes, sir.
so
They find you.
they find you. Yeah, right. So you can eulogize in Indian ancient tradition, this is karma, something comes flying to you. It's meant to be. But I think there is something very intrinsic in this process. People ask me, how do you do it? It's not that I read up everything, but that question takes me because I'm checking, reading literature, I'm looking for something familiar sounding.
It's like acting as a detective.
Detective,
Leads you
exactly.
somewhere.
Right. So it's like mind detector.
Yes,
You're
sir.
looking for a mind. So suddenly I discovered mass psycho. So certain books are lying in my library. I reread them. Suddenly I don't know how I picked them up. It's also partly intuitive.
After rereading, you have more interpretations that you never had before.
Exactly. So when I reread Eric Fromm, because I read Eric Fromm much before, like his Chains of Illusion and other books.
Yes, sir.
I reread those books. And I read William Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism. He makes this interesting formulation there,
Yes,
the
sir.
fascists combine rebellious emotions with reactionary values. Stellar, one line, captures.
Yes, sir.
It puts everything in place for me. What Mr. Modi does in this country is that is offering a rebellious emotions and combined with reactionary values. And where I use this concept of all places? I used it in Haryana. So you can concepts and formulations can travel that way. That what BJP and RSS is doing. So we'll have to also observe the right wing, even the phenomena with which you don't have a normative or political agreement. You have to also observe it with a sense of detachment. So you cannot completely only be opposed. So in that sense, an academic life. So you have two lives. I lead two lives. That's partly visible in one of the book discussions. One of my colleagues made a very interesting opening remark in the book discussion where he said my work has a lot of detached, realistic reading, but then it is punctured through passionate, ethical. So that's how I read it. I read a phenomena for what it is. So if somebody were to make a very communal comment on Muslims, I don't immediately jump to defend Muslims. I say, what could be the layered? Where is this coming from? Because there's always a social historical context. I'll see what is the content of this hatred? What is the content of this comment? Right? Then you understand historically how do you tune. Then my ethical concern that religious minorities should be inclusive. So when you fuse the two, then you make fresh formulations. So that's how I combine concepts. That's why my reading is very eclectic. I don't know. I don't believe in this sticking to one frame. I essentially would say that critical theory is where my work is grounded. Debates in critical theory, Shaila Benhabib, Judith Butler, Nancy Fraser, Axel Honneth, a range of critical theories. But then, as I said, I moved on to cultural sociology. I read post-colonial theory. Then I brought social psychology. Then I studied emotion studies, said how to study emotions. So then in this eclectic reading, combined with your engagement with reality, it's a fairly complex process. Sometimes you cannot even retrospectively explain how you have arrived at a formulation, but it's, I think, a continuous engagement with reality is and preparedness to question yourself that
Intellectual distance between
yeah.
things like with that are morally or politically charged, to not
So I
detach.
think a good academic, since this is also for students, is that a detached objectivity with passionate ethics.
Yes, sir.
So that I think we'll have to combine the two. That a detached, realistic reading combined with passionate ethical concerns. So that's where I think good theory comes from.
So you've also written for a much wider audience, The Hindu, The Wire, alongside just academic articles. So does the way you get through an argument change depending on who's the audience, or who's the audience who's reading that particular piece at that point?
Yeah, what happens when you write for larger audience is that the attempt should be to capture one dimension of the phenomenon. You can't capture the entire phenomenon, right? So in popular communication, like when you write a book or when you write a journal article, then you are trying to capture multiple dimensions of a phenomena.
Yes.
And the complexity and contradiction between those multiple dimensions in a phenomenon. That's the attempt in an academic. But when you're writing for popular audience, you're capturing in a stark way one dimension. And so this is the dimension that missed out. So that's where you want to engage, in a pressing way for the larger audience. So that shift is necessary.
Yes.
Now, I should share with you that when I first started writing for dailies like Hindu and others, the pieces used to be written. And it's always worry why are they not publishing?
Yes.
And invariably the comment used to be that these pieces are too theoretical. So I had to think, what does it mean? Why should, for popular audience, why should you not write a theoretical? They would say that this is beyond the bandwidth of our readers.
General audience.
General audience. They
The
will not be able to.
section particularly.
So then the question for me was, without compromising on the complexity of the idea,
Yes, sir.
how do you make it communicable? So I had to learn that and write. Many pieces were rejected, sent back. So I had to see, okay, this is my idea. What is that I can drop? Why certain concepts or jargon, then over a period of time, one gets used to it. But the attempt is to have this larger. So there is always a caution. My senior colleagues used to always caution me that, shouldn't, a good academic shouldn't write in popular media. So, so that's an interesting. So I kept thinking that is that a fair thing that good academics should not write in popular media because of the concern is this, that they told me that you will be short selling yourself. This is expression one of my senior colleagues used, that when you can write a much complex story, you'll have to write very simplified journalistic, boil it down. But then that caution was really a very stark caution. But then I kept thinking that is this something that a good academic should not be doing? The other caution was when I joined JNU. My senior academic said, "Don't give public talks." Under the tree, our students organize. Because again, their caution was that in this public talk, it's mostly rhetorical.
Yes, sir.
But I asked the question that why cannot we, instead of withdrawing from public talks, why can't we change the quality of public talks? Why don't we communicate more complex things in a language that can reach a larger audience? This is a challenge I set myself. And therefore, after that, I decided that I'll do everything. I'll publish books, I'll write in leading refereed journals like I did in Development and Change, I did in Social Text, Contributions Indian Sociology. I wrote books, for Cambridge University Press, Sage, and things. Then I wrote for magazines like Outlook and Frontline. I wrote for news dailies like Hindu, Indian Express. I gave public talks.
Yes.
In JNU, I give very regular public talks in JNU, which go viral. Then I give seminars, conferences. I go to Yale, but I go to Gwalior also.
Yes.
So I learn from, I think occupying Anushka heterogeneous spaces is an absolute must for my nature of work. At least that's what I feel. Many academics, I don't know if you're in sanitized spaces, if you're just writing for refereed, and if you're in university spaces, I think it's a tremendous limitation. I think that really cuts down your creative potential. You have to be in spaces that are uncomfortable to you. There are spaces that challenge you. So when I go to a seminar or a talk in Gwalior, many senior colleagues say, Gwalior, what will you get? What will you go to Gwalior? But I say, I learn so much from Gwalior. Sometimes I say I learn more in Gwalior than JNU. Because you meet different set of students who are used to colloquial language, who learn in mother tongues or Hindi speaking. They bring a different culture, different. But it's not that they are not bright. They sometimes have such interesting observations. They have such interesting takes on things. So I carry them with me. Sometimes I find those interactions are much more interesting than my interaction with students in JNU, where they give me sanitized, political language, and I know the limit of that. Polished, sanitized, like you guys coming from LSR, and so when I go down, there's much interesting conversations we can. It's only we need that ear to listen to those things. So that thing, I thought that my way of doing research, as I'm eclectical in my theoretical frame, I'm fairly eclectic in my social interactions. That I will listen to a Dalit, I might one day be sitting with a Muslim in Jamaat, next day I might be with a right winger, third day I'm at Yale, fourth day I'm at Cambridge, and fifth day I'm in JNU. So I think this heterogeneous spaces, you see that the different ways people think. People are engaging with life in very different way. This entire thing central to sociology, cultural sociology, is the attempt meaning making. They say that's the central human project.
Sociology of knowledge.
Sociology of that meaning making. How people make meaning of social lives they live, right? So like Andrew Sayers' moral foundations of class, he talks about such things. So when I see those heterogeneous spaces, people are all interacting and making different sense. So that's why, as I said, when I do these interactions while I have deep ethical, political, social concerns, whether it's with Muslims or Dalits, I don't immediately identify with them. You also have to have a distant observation. How is Jamaat? When I go to an organization like Jamaat, many of my colleagues said, no, they don't go. It's a fundamentalist organization. I thought it's all the more reason one should go. Go and interact. How do they make sense?
Yes.
How do they make sense of social? What are the social categories they use? And my experience with Jamaat has been that people said it's fundamentalist. But I went and gave them a talk on how they should be talking about non-Muslim issues too. And can you imagine that they immediately organize a press conference and now they are jumping into many movements and they say, sir, after your talk, we are doing this. They can be concrete implications, and it's so fulfilling to see that, so one should not have a closed mind. So one should not essentialize. I feel many scholars who talk about differences and multiculturalism are actually very closed and essentialized. But I think this is an art, and therefore here I feel in this kind of a research, it's not merely about method. I draw here from Nietzsche that he says it's also the personality of the researcher. What is our personality makeup? But you might have the best of scientific research method, you might have best of data, but can you avoid your personality
creeping in? Yes.
Creeping in the interpretation you offer?
Yes, sir.
Good, sir. You are getting it. Your generation is so bright. See, this is how I can't dismiss your generation. Now I'll have to be ready to learn. So Nietzsche says that every idea is an intuition finally that is flowing back to your personality. So he talks about Spinoza's ethics, and he says Spinoza has a very weak body, and therefore he offered a very formidable theory of ethics. I felt, when I read it, it resonated so much with my own experience that finally for me, I feel the ideas one generates, the theoretical one, is also about your personality. So I feel you'll have to create personality that is attuned to research. Good research does not come just from reading and good method training. So my personality, I've attuned to be self-critical, to be having ear to the ground, listening to voices that look banal and obvious sometimes. So if you talk to a common Muslim or an OBC, you might say things in a very common language. It might look obvious, but between the lines, if you read, or you take that idea and put in some other context, there could be some productive idea. So I'm always open for conversations, and my friends and all of them will tell you, students, that my room is always full. This guy helps me manage the the inflow, how to do. And he will tell you, one day I get journalists, I get students, undergraduate students sometimes come too. So many of my colleagues say, why do you waste time with undergraduate students? But sometimes you can have very interesting conversations with even undergrads. Of course, if they're too boring, I pass on.
Undergrad.
Yeah, exactly. So we can have. But again, I don't essentialize. I don't say that, like post-colonial scholars, I also don't romanticize things.
Yes, sir.
So there can be undergraduates who can bore me to death. So that's there I pass on the responsibility to him to see to that they have to find a way out as they found a way in. So they can be interesting, they may not be interesting. So I get social activists in my room.
Yes, sir.
I get big time academics from Brown University and places like that. So I think we have to inhabit heterogeneous temporalities without a sense of prejudice and without a sense of romanticism and essentialization. So it's a continuous process which has to be part of your being, and that's where I feel interesting and good research will come out.
So it's almost as if you cannot argue if you're not uncomfortable.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think continuous sense of discomfort
Discomfort, yes, sir.
has to become a sense, something that some might call this sadomasochism, way of existing. But this, I think, has to be part of, I think this is the only democratic way of doing academics.
Yes, sir.
So I have Dalit students who, many of them come and sometimes challenge my formulation. Sir, I disagree with you. So there may not be always depth in what they say, but even that surface level critique has to be taken on ground. Why is somebody saying that? Why is somebody not convinced with what you're saying? That democratic ethic we should have. So I always listen to them very carefully. I carry their ideas into my writings. I always tweak and carry my, no, I always say that if I don't have interactions with Muslim, Dalit, OBC, people from backward regions, I don't think I would have been half creative and half productive that I have been. So at some point, I have to dedicate one of my books to all of them, the students. I am open, and you would be surprised to know that I am open to even right-wing students. I have a right-wing PhD, those who are very fundamentalist, those who have acidic anti-Muslim, and many of my colleagues will be very surprised that why do you take right-wing students? I said, I won't even learn from them. What makes them feel? So my recent talk that I gave, in JNU last week, I titled it as Understanding Hindu Anxiety and Muslim Insecurity in New India. So interacting with the right wing, I also learned that why Hindus are going through this phase of anxiety. You can simply dismiss it as propaganda, fascism, RSS mobilization. Yes, part of it is that. But there has to be a social ground for a majority community in a country where there are 80% to feel so anxious.
Yes, sir.
Isn't it? Against Muslims who are already so weak, socially underdeveloped. So how does this come, this anomalous condition? Isn't it a deep question for us to investigate rather than being dismissive about? So you cannot learn that unless you interact with them, isn't it? Yes. I request my right wing to bring. Sometimes I have also interacted with RSS pracharaks in my room. I had long sittings with them.
The more the merrier.
So the more you know, so you may not agree with them, but you don't have to have shutters down.
It is like Voltaire said, I think, that I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend till death your right to say.
Right to say. So that you have to practice that.
Yes, sir.
That you have to practice that, but I also express my disagreement with them. So it's not that we don't resist them. So I'm not one of those liberals who will say let all multiple epistemologies flow, let everyone have their say. No, I will resist right-wing, toxic, majoritarian culture.
Yes,
So
sir.
I have that activist tinge in them, but I would want to resist them in intelligent ways, in ways that can decenter that essentialized picture of rather than just have uh, head-on
Head on.
collision kind of a thing. So that's where my academic thinking also might kick in.
So coming to the very last question.
Hmm.
So for you, after politics of post-civil society, revolutionary violence versus democracy, emotions in New India, India after Modi, if you had to describe your own voice of research, if you
Hmm.
had to name it,
Since your series is called Voice of
different
Research.
voices of research, yes, sir.
So as I said, I think my voice of research. How do is it necessary? I should give one tag that I think the essential thing I find in my research is that how continuity of my past frameworks and theoretical formulations I've already always read them in ways that are open-ended to accommodate new frames.
Yes.
So I've never read anything in a very close manner. So I never read anything in terms of mutually exclusive, right? I see reality is constituted by parallel and incommensurate discourses and practices. So I don't think good research, good academics, unfortunately, I do not know where this has crept into social theory, that we feel that we'll have to offer theoretical formulations that are complete, sanitized, rounded, and they should read comprehensive.
Mm. Yes.
I would want to make moves and counter moves. I want to be self-contradictory. I don't, have big, hesitation in making a formulation and also making a counter formulation, because I say sometimes reality is that way. It's all uneven social locationalities. The point is what sense you make. It is not to iron out the self-contradictoriness, but what meaning can you generate out of this immanence of self-contradictory practices. For that, I think we should have the temerity and the strength. That's why, again, I draw your attention to personality.
Yes.
One should not, I think we get very traumatized by contradictoriness. And we don't enjoy inconsistencies because we feel it's both unethical. We have been socialized to think that way.
But they're like very important to get somewhere, to get to a higher level.
Higher level than to look at a destination.
Yes, sir.
So I don't want to get into any destination. I want to be in journey. I think the journey is the destination. I think you keep learning, unlearning, you make formulations, and I think making those formulations is how you intervene. But things are always in flux. Therefore, I have never hesitated also combining, like as I said, critical theory with cultural sociology. Many colleagues have suggested this is methodologically problematic. But I find when reality does not fit into any neat method, should one be trained in social sciences to look at a method in one particular way?
But how will inventions happen then?
How will
How will we
You'll have to have clash of ideas, not clash of civilizations,
Yes.
but clash of ideas. You have learn, unlearn, and I think if all of us see it as an endless process,
Yes, sir.
not a destination, not a high pedestal where we have to reach. Uh, also because that's how unpredictable the world is. It's like when I give a public talk. No, you never know how much it will reach. Sometimes you think you have given a very ordinary piece, ordinary talk, it goes viral.
It blows up.
Sometimes you think I have given a very comprehensive thing, people are not indifferent. So how do you explain all this? So I think we should make curiosity is a democratic ethic. I think the only way to relate to it is being curious. So I enjoy when my talks don't do well. Oh, good, interesting. Why are they not listening? That should be the question. Instead of saying, oh, they should have heard, these are fools who are not listening to me. So I don't think that should disappoint you. So if you take that curiosity as an ethic, then I think life is less of a disappointment. And you can be in the creative processes is where it is both. I think democratic, I think also much creative writing will come out of it.
Thank you, sir. Those were very beautiful insights. And that brings us to the end of today's podcast. On behalf of IJRP, I would like to thank Professor Ajay Gudavarthy, sir, for sharing such valuable insights. Um, if you like this podcast, please feel free to share it with your peers and colleagues. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep contributing to meaningful research.